Yeah, hello, welcome to this video. Yeah, this is a new video on an opening. Yeah, it's not a very popular opening, but an opening that does pop up from time to time. And for the white player, it's often something that you're pretty much surprised about because it's not played often and it's very aggressive. I'm talking about the Albin Countergambit. Yeah, that opening doesn't have a very sound refutation, and with some with some justification. It's not particularly great for black, but if you don't know what to do against it, then it can be a pretty decent practical weapon for the black player. That means if you are white and you play the Queen's Gambit, you better have something prepared against it. What I'm going to do in this video is to show two ways for white to play against the Albins. There is one way, and this is the main line nowadays, that is pretty convincing, I think, in showing that white should have an advantage against this opening. However, we cannot expect to win outright. Yeah, it is not that bad. It's not like the Latvian Gambit, for example, which is pretty much losing, yeah, if white knows what he's doing, as I showed in an earlier video. Against the Albins, we can expect an advantage, but not to win straight away. There's actually a second option that I'm also going to show at the end of the video that is somewhat related to the line that I'm presenting you. Okay, d takes e5, white takes the pawn, of course, and black pushes d4. That's the idea of the Albins. With that pawn advancing, white is hindered here with this development. So that pawn on d4 is obstructing white's position. On the other hand, the pawn on e5 is also obstructing black's position. So knight f6, for example, is impossible. Yeah, it never struck me as being very logical, this opening, but let's see what to do about it. Knight f3, that's very natural. We attack that pawn on d4, and black is covering it with knight c6. Here white has a big choice. Many moves have been tried over the years. For a very long time, g3 was the main line, but nowadays this has changed, and basically all books nowadays recommend the move a3. Yeah, a3. Why such a slow-looking move on this side of the board? It has a very direct idea that pawn on d4 is somewhat exposed. If white gets to play b4 and bishop b2, black is almost unable to keep the pawn. It will be very difficult for him to withstand that pressure of three pieces attacking it, queen, bishop, and knight. So this is something that black has to take into account now. He cannot just ignore that idea. Also, it just takes control over the b4 square, which sometimes is just annoying that there's a check. For example, there is this famous idea e3, bishop
check.
e4 check, bishop d2 takes
check.
Here. And at the end of all this, and this is not the Lasker trap, that is even worse, but here black also has an excellent position. So a3 is a good multi-purpose move. Let's have a look at this move, a3. What is black supposed to do? Yeah, here he has an overwhelming main line. Then main line is knight g to e7. The idea is that black is going to go knight g6 and trying to capture that e5 pawn. We will look at this later. It's the main line, but first let's check what else black has tried. He has tried quite a couple of moves, and yeah, we can pretty much state with some confidence that none of them are really any good. There's a5, just looking to stop the b4 move. The disadvantage of this is, of course, that with a5 being played, black has a hard time to castle long, which is quite often the idea in the Albins. Knight bd2 now is good, intending knight b3, trying to pick up that pawn anyway. And well, this is very serious. Yeah, if black plays like a4 to prevent that, we will go b4, takes, and this is falling. and then it's 2 pawns. Yeah, I mean, that's really something to take into account for black. What did he usually try? Bishop g4, and now white is just going to play h3, attacking that bishop. Yeah, black now can give up the bishop pair on f3 or play bishop h5. After bishop h5, a very good move is queen a4, using that pin. Now that the pin cannot be broken with any bishop d7, white is white is a lot better here. Sometimes we can even go g4 with a tempo. Another annoying move is queen b3. It's also very inconvenient to meet. You want to play rook b8 here in this position? Yeah, as I said, there are many good options. Black can also take, of course, something like this, but this has given white the bishop pair now, and in this kind of position it is in fact very useful that we have controlled the square. So in some cases we can just play like bishop f4 and g3, e3. White is really just a pawn up. Black has no compensation for that whatsoever. So a5 is not really doing a good job. Black also tried the move f6, just getting rid of that e5 pawn. However, after the capture, knight f6 and e3, it's really not clear what black's big compensation is. Note that, again, he cannot support that pawn due to b4. This is really a repeating theme throughout those lines. Bishop g4, we just play bishop e2. And this is just a pawn, really. Black has no particular compensation. Note that if black is trying for some kind of long castling, not quite sure if he even manages here as d4 is hanging, but yeah, in general, that a3 move also prepares this b4, b5 idea if he castles long. So a3 proves to be quite a good move in many scenarios. If black goes bishop e6, trying to castle long quickly, we go knight bd2, covering c4, knight g7, and now knight b3. b4 is also pretty decent, but we can look at that pawn immediately. Bishop here, knight takes d4. So one important thing has happened. We've gotten rid of that obstructing pawn. That's really a huge progress. And something like knight d4, queen d4. Again, where is black's compensation for the pawn? It's pretty much non-existent. Yeah, I mean, but it's not like you're winning. Yeah? White is not having also. He doesn't have a big attack against the king or anything. Yeah, it's not losing, but white is a pawn up. It's a double pawn, but it's really nice position to have. So bishop e6 also doesn't help, and then this bishop g4. That looks maybe the most active looking move, but also not really helping a lot. We go knight bd2, and now black can try various things. The thing is, how can he get to castle long? I mean, this is really a goal here. If queen d7 is played, we're going b4 and really asking black, do you want to castle long? If this happens, we have something like h3, and again b5, queen a4. Yeah, it's rather white who's attacking here. This is the important thing. Black really doesn't have any sort of attack. It's rather black's king was in more danger. We are pretty okay on e1, and quite often white will still play the g-pawn and fianchetto later. It's just a very, very good position. Sometimes black players try queen e7 to have a look at the e5 pawn. This is somewhat better than queen d7, but again, after h3, bishop h5. Yeah, if this happens, black has some problem of playing a good move now. I mean, you want to castle long, but after bishop g5, f6, e takes f, and here bishop f4, it's really questionable if black has enough compensation. Yeah, he's got relatively good development, but I'm going g3, bishop g2, and this is still happening. So it doesn't really look very convincing. And bishop g5 is not the only move. You can also play bishop f4. That's also pretty decent. Bishop h5 is the more popular move in relative terms. That position is already quite rare. Queen a4, getting ready to be active against the long castle. Yeah, long castles. And now b4. Yeah, we're really counter-attacking, not just sitting there with the pawn and hope for the best. Yeah, what about this position? How can black continue? If he takes on e5, we're going to take here. Note that we cannot easily take here, as d3 is pretty awkward. Check on a8 is not helping at all. So something else. What should white play? Yeah, white has good continuations here, and bishop b2 is one of them, g4 is the other one. Bishop b2 is a bit simpler, getting this pin set up. And now let's say king b8, g4, bishop g6, bishop g2. Yeah, and it's rather white who's having an attack. Let's see how that line might continue. Yeah, and white's attack is getting overwhelming here, really. d4 is also under heavy fire. It is just not any good, this bishop g4 long castles idea. It's important that white is counter-attacking. We're not just sitting on the pawn. So those are the somewhat rare alternatives to knight g7. Knight g7 is by far the best move, and this gives black at least a playable position. It's not particularly great, but we will see. It's a playable position. b4, that was the idea. And now knight to g6. Bishop b2. And instead of knight g6, black sometimes has tried bishop g4, by the way. It's somewhat similar to earlier, but now knight f5. Yeah, sometimes that has been tried, but after queen d3, sometimes intending queen e4, white is pretty substantially better. Bishop h6 and f4. Yeah, that's really bad. So much better is knight g6, bishop b2. Yeah, and now black has a choice. He can play the move a5, insert that, a5, b5, and then take on e5, or he can play the move knight g takes e7. If black just takes the pawn, let's start with that. We're going to capture, and then play the move e3. That's an important point, using that pin. Yeah, what should black do now? The only really playable option is bishop e6, and now white takes on d4, knight c4, queen c2. We will see something very similar in the main line with a5 inserted. This is just a somewhat worse version of that, because here the queenside structure is somewhat more favorable for white. Bishop e7, castles, and now we see the problems with this setup. Black cannot castle now, as h7 is under fire. White has an extra center pawn here with the e-pawn, and he has some pressure, like c7. Knight is somewhat misplaced on d6. It's not something that you can expect to win quickly, but white is much better. Bishop f6 is what they try here, and after the capture, knight c3, white's position is just very nice. For example, c6. And white enjoys a pretty substantial advantage. We will probably win a pawn here. The c-pawn is very likely to fall. Still a lot of work, but yeah, it's a great opening result. So if we go back, The immediate knight capture is not helping black, so they go a5. This is somewhat better because now after b5, knight takes e5, we reach pretty much the same thing, but now with a5 and b5 inserted, the pressure is a little bit reduced on black. Still, white is a bit better. Bishop e6, bishop d4, knight c4, queen c2, knight d6. This move has been recommended sometimes, but after knight c3, queen g5, white is better in more than one way. The most convincing seems to be bishop c4, after which, yeah, this is
check,
just good for white. Or queen g2, and here there's a funny line, bishop e6, queen h1,
check,
here, and now knight d5, and white is winning in the attack. I know it looks it looks a bit crazy, but it does win. Yeah, queen a3, knight
check,
c7 check, and the threats are just too much. Yeah, something like this.
check,
Yeah, and now there's a big threat of queen e4. Yeah, so let's say, I don't know what black should do, like h6, just one move to show.
check,
Here, and
check,
mate.
mate.
quite a funny line. But this is something that can, it's difficult to play this if you don't know it, yeah, especially in a rapid or blitz game. But if you know that this leads to a winning attack, you can go for such things. Yeah, queen d5 is not really doing the job. The best is indeed for black to just go back. And now bishop d3, we know this idea already. And here queen g5 is the most testing idea. Yeah, what should white do now? Probably f4, covering this with the queen. And black now goes to d5 or checks on h4.
Check.
Like this, and now just developing. Yeah, we can already see that white has to be somewhat better here with his better central control, nicely placed pieces on d4 and d3. But of course, this is not over yet. Yeah, white is better, but it's not like you're winning quickly. This is especially true in comparison to some other really bad gambits. If you look at black's king position, black's king position is quite okay. He has made strategic concessions in the center, but it's not like he's giving up. He's not materially down and has a bad king or anything. So you cannot just chalk up your point if you see the Albins played against you, but you can expect to have a good game. Black also tried this move and knight c3, queen b3, after which white, the trade is not bad for white, but it seems to be better even to keep the queen on the board with queen f2. This is due to an interesting line. After knight f5, white can take and go e4. This is pretty strong. One idea is that now after castles long, white can castle short. And now after queen c4, white has the very strong move knight d5. Yeah, what is the point of this? It's a neat little tactic. If black grabs this pawn,
check.
There's this check. Forking. So black has to take, and after rook c1, white is winning the queen. So this is not forced, of course. Yeah, don't tell me in the comments you said the Albins leads to a forced win of the queen. That's not true, but I'm just showing some ideas why this in particular, that queen f2 move, is good, because it is only good because this is precisely working. Yeah, we have to note that if white grabs here, bishop c5 is going to kill white right away. Yeah, white is totally overloaded here. Bishop d4, queen is on that. Yeah, let's say like rook b1.
Check.
Check. Check. And white is totally losing. So it's a pretty narrow path here to an advantage. So this is a good line against the Albins. Why am I saying I present 2 lines? Isn't that enough? It actually is enough, but while checking this, I happened to stumble upon a recent show that was broadcasted on the ICC, where international master John Watson was asked, what do you think is good against the Albins? And of course I expected him to recommend a3, but he didn't. He recommended a different move, and I had a brief look at it, and I have to agree that it's also pretty good. In some and lots of cases actually it will transpose to a3. That move is knight bd2. That's an interesting alternative that is not as well known. What is the point? Well, the knight very often goes there anyway, because the pawn on d4 is that obstructing force. You cannot go to c3. What should black do now? The main line is again knight ge7. Just as after a3. And it's funny, in many cases we will actually transpose to the a3 line. For example, if black plays bishop g4, looking very logical, then white is playing a3, and we get exactly the position that we had looked at earlier after a3, bishop g4, knight bd2. It's just a transposition. Just to remind you, it was something like this: a3, queen e7, h3, bishop h5, b4. We had this, and then queen a4. This kind of game. Look earlier in the video for more on that. So bishop g4 transposes. What else is there? Let me have a look at my notes. Not much actually, because knight b3 is pretty awkward. What else is there? I mean, okay, black can always play f6 and drop this pawn, but as we earlier checked, this is not going to be enough compensation. Even knight bd2 comes into consideration here. Looking at this pawn directly, that's never enough compensation. Something like bishop here, maybe bishop d2, queen e7, but white can take and play this. Where exactly is black's compensation? I don't see it. So f6 is not going to do any good. Something like bishop e6, for example, can be answered with knight b3 as well, and we're going to pick up that pawn again. I mean, we are already 1 pawn up. If we get d4, we can easily trade d against c pawn here. So what do they play? They play knight ge7. The idea is that now after knight b3, black can go knight f5 to protect that pawn. That looks pretty logical, but I still think that white is better, because white has to move e4, just attacking that knight, and now black's options are very, very slim. He has to take the pawn en passant. There's really no alternative to that, otherwise you just lose d4. I mean, if you play this, for example, white is just happily grabbing the next pawn, so it's not going to work. So black has to take. Now we just trade queens. Knight takes. That's better than king takes. You don't want to give up castling rights. And now we just take this, and well, what kind of endgame is that? White is a pawn up in this position. Admittedly, it's a double pawn, but still the e5 pawn is a pretty, it's some nuisance on e5. White has much better central control, and I just think that this is a pretty bad endgame for black. We also have to take into account that this kind of position is not exactly what the Albin's Countergambit player is aiming for, defending an endgame a pawn down. So this is also an excellent opening result, and you can argue that this is maybe even more promising than the main line of the a3 variation. So if you want something very, very low maintenance, I mean, a3 is also not particularly sophisticated, but if you want something simple against the Albins, you can go knight bd2, knight ge7, knight b3, knight f5, e4 leads to the endgame, and everything else that black can do is rather very fishy, with bishop g4 or is something like f6, where he's a pawn down for not enough compensation. So knight bd2 is also a very, very good weapon. a3 is, as I said, the main line nowadays, and is suggested in basically any book, in Boris Avrook's books, and Lars Schandorf's book, and so on. I checked all the recent books; they all have a3. And it's good, it's certainly good, but knight bd2, as John Watson says, is also pretty good. So we can play one of the two moves. Both can be recommended without any particular problem. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video, and now you have something good against the Albins if you're a d4 player. Thanks for watching.